I started more with presenting summaries of studies and, little things here and there. People would ask me, oh, is it true that if I have type blood A, I'm more prone to a worse outcome from COVID? So I started doing more of that, little pieces of information. And then I realized that the objective is really a larger one. Yeah. It is scientific literacy, but also teaching people how to do risk analysis in their everyday lives, because I do think that that's what's going to get us to engage more with people who have different views.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's conversation is with Nini Munoz, and I came to know her through her amazing Instagram account, where she's taking data and presenting it in a very, very digestible way. And I've done enough. I spent enough time in science and spent enough time reading research papers to know that there's a world of difference between the paper, the way it's written by the scientists, and then making it digestible to the public. There's a giant gap. And Nini, I got to say, you're one of the best I've ever seen at creating infographics and summarizing data and putting it into easy to understand terms. And obviously, in the last half year, there's been a certain focus to your Instagram page, and that's been COVID. So, how did you get so good at digesting and presenting information, and kind of what gives you the right to talk about COVID to a larger audience?
Hi. Well, thank you. Thanks for the compliment. I appreciate it, because there are certainly a lot of very talented, scientific communicators. So I've been handling large batches of data for a very long time. So, I'm an electrical engineer. So I always like to leave that very clear to my audience. I'm not an infectious disease researcher nor an epidemiologist. Wow. But I know how to...
That's totally all right, because on the other side, we've got yoga practitioners, Ayurvedic practitioners, and meathead jocks telling people what to do. So at least you have references for what you're talking about. At least your link tree is full of actual citations and actual studies, which I've gone through, and I've got some familiarity with that as well. So yes, you're an electrical engineer, but the way that you handle data and talk about risk is quite amazing.
Yeah. So, I think I started like everybody else, right? Just kind of trying to inform our friends and families about what was happening. I mean, we have a once in a lifetime, sometimes, event that's affecting everybody at the same scale with the lockdowns, and everybody had all these questions, and there was huge surge of misinformation. And, I have a research background as well. So I actually completed a fantastic and interdisciplinary PhD. So I did the combination of electrical engineering and neuroscience and microbiology, because my advisor kind of told me, you have to get all of these people on your committee or I'm not going to let you graduate. And at that time I was working on graphene implants for the gut. So our second brain. So I have a lot of experience in, reading and analyzing research, but also on a day-to-day, I handle large batches of data. I've done it for almost, 10 years now, since I, left Cornell. And so much of what I was seeing was people misrepresenting data. And so at that time, I identified kind of several objectives. One of them, of course, was to immediately try to communicate the information correctly. This is what this means. But at the same time, I think that the underlying tone or goal of my account has always been that extra step, which is, I don't want to just tell you what this means. I want you to learn so that you can infer what it means. And so that's where I started doing the tutorials, where I teach people about statistics and scientific literacy. And I teach them, how do you look through a study? How do you determine that there are no biases in how the participants are selected? Because that can skew a study, right? Mm-hmm. How do you make sure that the data that is being presented is sufficiently stratified so that, again, you're not getting these skews? And so that has really become like, one of the overarching themes with this account. But the other side of what I do, and I work in aviation where you can imagine, right? The stakes are high in aviation. Yeah. So, we've seen it with what happened with the Boeing, 737 MAX, right? That was like a big issue. And so some of what we do there, when we design parts and whether it's for aviation, and before that I was doing biosensors, you need, as an engineer, one needs to understand what are the risks with any product. And that's very, very layered. So you have, of course, the risks that come with a flawed design. You have the risk with the process, the procedures, with materials. And then you have risks around people, right? So you can design a great piece of software, but if your pilot does not know how to use it, right? And so I started to recognize that a lot of the conversations, right, that I was encountering online and people's apprehension towards lockdowns or disbelief of the situation was really coming or kind of tethered to different perceptions of risk. And so I kind of recognized that early on. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. So the people that don't want lockdowns, kind of kept saying, well, I don't care if I get the virus, my immune system is fine and I'm healthy. The
magical human immune system.
Which is okay to handle a virus, but not a vaccine. I'm still trying to figure that one out. So I started to realize, I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating because, so our discourse has, as I mentioned, has become extremely contentious, especially over the last, 4 years, right? And that is because people's perception of risk around key issues is vastly different. Okay. And that's when I realized, I'm like, wow, this is something that I can bring to the table because this is what I do. And I started to talk more about that and put that within the context of the information, because at the end of the day, what we're doing here is we are doing risk communication, right? Like risk analysis it's a science-based practice. So it's not like it doesn't use the science, but equally important, and as I was mentioning before, equally important is risk communication. We need to learn how to communicate risks in a way that is comprehensible and it makes sense for people who may have different perceptions of what those risks are. And so that's kind of like what I've been, trying to tailor the account towards. I started more with presenting summaries of studies and, little things here and there. People would ask me, oh, is it true that if I have type blood A, I'm more prone to a worse outcome from COVID? So I started doing more of that, little pieces of information. And then I realized that the objective is really a larger one. Yeah. It is scientific literacy, but also teaching people how to do risk analysis in their everyday lives, because I do think that that's what's going to get us to engage more with people who have different views.
So can you give an example of how people are having difficulty doing risk analysis? From a personal perspective, I can cite all kinds of data and I can argue about, the number of excess deaths in the United States or worldwide and say this many hundreds of thousands of people have died in the country. And it doesn't move people as much as a story of a coworker in his mid-20s who's still down from long COVID now months and months after. That story of that one example of long COVID, it's like what Stalin said about one death is a tragedy, a death of a million is just a statistic.
Oh, I'll let you know why. So, I've actually discussed this before. So when we look at risk is actually a factor of different variables, right? So something can be very severe, but very unlikely to happen.
So right? For example, getting hit by a meteorite.
Exactly, right? That's extremely severe, but extremely rare. Whereas, something cannot have such severe consequences, but it can be more likely to happen, like falling down, right? Sure. You can fall down. And so what I've noticed is that a lot of conversations around risk really tether around how severe, things are. And and of course, the relationship that has to one's own personal experience. And so, the idea of living with a disability, right? That is something that a lot of people, especially people who are younger, who may have not experienced that before, that sounds like a very extreme, severe consequence. And so I noticed, and I discuss this a lot, via messaging, when people kind of tell me, well, I don't think it's going to be that bad, but they work together, and I'm going to explain why. So for instance, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So for instance, in many areas, I'm in California, and in many areas here, we had gotten to the point where the ICUs were just packed, right? And it was kind of interesting that I heard both my husband and another friend say, oh, we cannot go ride our bikes right now. So they go up to the mountains and ride their bike. And I was, and it became very clear why. Because even though that's a low risk activity for them, if now they have an accident,
high consequences,
they would not be able to get the medical attention. And so one of the reasons why I keep pushing this whole, risk analysis conversation is because it really allows you to identify, this is what we call failure modes, all the different ways in which something is going to affect us, right? So it may not be COVID per se. You may think that, the risk there is low to you, but hey, the risk of of an accident, especially if you're riding your bike in, in mountain terrain, right? That can be, that can have severe consequences. And now you can't, the severity component goes up with that. And so the same thing with the other element to it that I don't mention too often, but does matter in some instances is detectability. So how detectable something is also plays into risk. And we see this with cancers, right? Like some cancers have become less lethal because of our ability to detect them, right? We have now more regular screenings, but if you were not able to go in and get your screening and that cancer keeps growing, then you would have a worse outcome. So the variables are not entirely independent, right? So you've got your severity, your detectability, and your likelihood of it happening. And I think really people tether to that, that severe. And that's really what drives the emotional response, right? People think about the severity. With vaccines, people think about this worst outcome, this worst case scenario. Whereas on the flip side of the coin, with COVID, you've had people kind of thinking that it's not going to be as bad. So it's fascinating to me because, as somebody who analyzes risk, I've always just thought, well, the outcome from COVID seems kind of unpredictable. Even for some young, healthy people, we've seen really unpredictable outcomes. And it's really hard to determine. It is very hard to determine for a young, healthy person what the outcome is going to be. I mean, we do see increased factors associated with, other comorbidities and, heart disease and hypertension. There's some indicators of obesity. Some of the data there is not sufficiently stratified. So it's kind of hard to tell if it's, at the 25, 30, 35, where do you draw the line? But there is some indication of that. But for a young, healthy person that now could be left with long COVID or some type of an autoimmune type of event, it's very unpredictable. And so now hearing to this long COVID, right, for a lot of young people, they relate more to that because they probably associate deaths more with people with these comorbidities, right? Oh, that's less likely to happen to me, right? And it's true, right? You don't see a high number of deaths. The death rates are actually quite rare in the younger populations, whereas the long COVID outcome, right? Now there's a higher likelihood of that happening too.
I'd like to draw attention to the way that you answered that, which is we don't have the data right now, or I don't have the data right now to answer that specific question intelligently, which is something that a lot of influencers don't do. This is the answer. I am the light, the truth, and the way. I know the right thing. I know that, I don't know, all vaccines are a sham. I know that COVID, that you're going to be 100% safe unless you're 95 years old. And this difference between asserting absolute knowledge and saying, based on the data right now, I mean, I've gone to scientific conferences. I've attended many, many seminars given by scientists, and they're forever couching, like, if the data that I have is correct, and if we did the statistical analysis correctly, and if we're interpreting the outcome of the statistics properly, then this is what it would seem to indicate. And the trouble there is that that's correct speaking, because we don't know for sure. I mean...
Absolutely. You want to hear a riddle?
Sure.
How do you tell a scientist from a non-scientist?
It's going to be something about a probability or...
I usually say because a scientist has been humbled by his own work, right? Scientists, we go through such an iterative, process of designing, carrying out the experiment, finding the errors and kind of concluding that we don't know anything. And you really can tell when you talk to like a scientist versus a non-scientist in the way they communicate about information and about data, right?
Yeah.
It comes down to, here's what we can infer from the data that is available to us, right? Yeah. Like what we can infer from the data that is available to us in regards to AstraZeneca is that it's extremely unlikely that it is correlated with, blood clots.
But you've thrown like 3 hedge terms into that sentence, all of which are correct. And it makes for a less compelling message than AstraZeneca is the devil's work and it's going to turn you gay and it's going to put a microchip in your head or whatever, like whatever the...
Yeah, which is of course more polarizing. And unfortunately, that's also how these algorithms work. So that's what I've also noticed is that these, accounts that tend to be extremely polarizing always garner like the most attention. I just see it across. I'm only on Instagram. I don't go on any of the other platforms, but that's constantly the feedback that I get, even from other people that are on other platforms. Everybody just wants to be right, and they go to great lengths to be right. And I'm the kind of person that says, if you're the smartest person in the room, leave. Like,
you're in the wrong room.
You're hanging with the wrong. There's, personally, for me, one of like the most beautiful aspects of life is just being able to continuously learn and being able to change my own mind about different things. Like I interact with people from all walks of life and all sides of the political spectrum, by the way. So my follower base kind of like goes across the political spectrum, which I really appreciate because it goes back to what we were discussing earlier, which is this risk assessment. The perception of risk is different. What is risky to you is not risky to me. And if I can understand where the perception of risk is for people who oppose my beliefs, I can really start tailoring an argument to actually have a meaningful discussion. And say, hey, listen, yeah, I see why this matters to you, but what if we did this? What if we put in this containment strategy? What if we put in this mitigation strategy? And all of a sudden, that risk to you might go from a level 5 to a level 1 and everybody's happy. And so much of what I do, and it's interesting, I do it, for, sensors, of course, that has many different levels of risk, but I've been able to extrapolate to these more, complex and deeper topics that I think we really need to touch upon, because what I'm seeing is people just not having conversations with each other. They're just kind of like, this is what I think. And people are just, what are they doing? They're just hearing to respond. They're not really listening or thinking about the details of what they're saying.
You had an excellent post a while ago about calculating risk level and kind of how much risk should you be willing to tolerate based on what your personal situation is, what your familial situation is, who you come in contact with, what measures you've taken to mitigate the risk on the other side.
Yeah.
Can you take us through your thought process there and kind of these two opposing
Yeah, it's kind of funny because somebody recently contacted me in public health to see if we turned that into like an app. They really liked it. Somebody was like, this would make a great app. So in risk analysis, right, because we've talked about this, you actually do these calculations, right? So it's called your risk priority number. And pretty much you have your three variables, which is how severe is it, what is the likelihood of it happening, and how detectable is it, right? And then you assign a 1 to 10 rating, right? So if something's extremely severe, it's a 10. If it's not severe at all, it's a 1. If it's very detectable, it's a 1. And if it's not detectable, it's a 10. And then if something happens really often, like everyday occurrence, it's a 10. And then if it rarely happens, like 1 per million times, then it's a 1. So this is literally what you do when you're trying to dial in the risk for the parts that you're making. You input every single way something can fail, and you calculate your risk priority number. So something that's,
for example, you'd be going, they're going to make this bolt for this airplane incorrectly once every 10 million times. And then you give that a number from 1 to 10.
Exactly.
Okay. And if that bolt fails, the whole wing falls off, that would be a 10 in consequences. Or if that bolt fails, it would be embarrassing, and the light, the blinking light at the wing would go out. That'd be a 1. Is that the kind of thought process?
So the failure would be a 10. It's a critical failure, right? So the more severe, right? And then because it would be unlikely to happen, 1 out of 10 million, it would be a 1 for detectability. So pretty much, if it's really bad, it's always a 10, right? So if something is not detectable, we kind of think it's really bad. And so I kind of built that little risk assessment tool around that, right? So, I try to, of course, simplify it because, I'm trying to do the communication part of it. And what I'm telling people is, listen, there's 2 components here when we discuss risk of interaction. It's the risk you pose to another person and the risk they have of a really bad outcome, right? That's the formula, right, between the 2 parties. And so what I've kind of, made that little scale, and I told people, listen, every mitigation strategy that you introduce, whether that is staying home when you're sick, wearing your masks, being outside, washing your hands, covering your mouth when you cough, with, of course, the really good ones being taking a PCR test and getting a vaccine. Like every single layer that you do reduces your risk, right? So it takes you, from like a 10 to like a 1, right? And then, of course, you have to measure that against, the risk of another person. So I built it off of this model, right? And so for people, we know that children at lower at risk. We know that vaccinated individuals are at very low risk of infection because we already have the data. And then you get into like the different groups, which are pregnant women are at higher risk than non-pregnant women, and then older adults. And then we know that, underlying conditions and of course, older age are highly correlated with worse outcome. We really see that in the mortality data. I mean, we're looking at the case fatality rates are high. They're 13% in some of these groups. That's extremely high. Yeah,
if you're male and 80 years old, I mean, your odds of ending up in the hospital, I forget what they were. I looked it up, like something like 40%.
Yeah,
maybe
that sounds
50,
about right.
And your chance of dying is something like 15%. It's not good to be male in this case.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just reading an article about that, which talks about how men are having like the most acute infection, but women tend to present the long COVID symptoms. Okay. And that's, I mean, I can't really speak to it. I just can, what I glimpsed was it has to do with the X chromosome. Like the X, there's a protective factor in there. So kind of based on that, I kind of said, okay, well, yeah, like you can calculate how risky you are to somebody else, right? Like if I don't want to be risky to like a friend who's pregnant and hasn't been vaccinated, like I'm going to take all these measures, but even more importantly, I'm going to just maybe not see anybody for 2 weeks until I can see her, right? And so this is just like a layered approach. And then, then I kind of played around and set the scales and I said, okay, if you can stay under 10 with the different combinations, it kind of worked itself out where it kind of makes sense. I was like, oh, this actually worked out great. But that was like the whole idea behind it. So what I'm doing is the person who could be at risk of infection, I am the likelihood and they are the severity. Right?
Yeah.
So here I can exclude detectability, right? Because
so you're
really
talking
don't know.
about not personal risk, but the basically making other people bear the consequences of your actions, right?
Exactly.
It's not me, I don't know, juggling, not me playing Russian roulette where I'm likely to first and foremost kill myself. It's taking my gun and just shooting it in random directions in the neighborhood.
Exactly.
I'm probably not going to kill myself if I do that. I mean, things could go wrong, but probably I'm going to kill somebody else. So that's the risk that you're analyzing there.
Yeah. Yeah, like the risk we pose to others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is, I mean, ultimately, so much of this has been around that, right? And I think...
Do you think that's getting through to people? Because I'm still running into people like, take your own risk, right? That I'm free. I'm free to take my own risk. And my answer is always, yeah, you are. And if your consequences only affected, if all the consequences of your actions only fell on your own shoulders, I endorse you climbing the north face of the Eiger naked and upside down in the middle of winter. If that's what you live for, you're probably going to die, but you're not going to kill anybody else. Do you think that what I don't agree with is you doing that with your 2-year-old son strapped to your back? Because if you die, he's going to die. Do you think this realization that it's not all about personal risk, that it's about the risk that we pose to others, is beginning to sink in?
That's an excellent question. And to be fair, I'm not sure. I mean, I've had people reach out to me and say that they've used my post to convince their neighbors to wear masks. So when I did a whole post talking about like the physics behind the particles and why they worked as source control. And so I do think there's some of that, going on, but to what extent, I don't know. But then that's why it comes back, and I'm kind of going to, pivot back to what I was discussing earlier. So for that person, their perceived risk from an infection is low, right? They're kind of saying, I'm going to do whatever I want, but what they don't realize is that when they do that, and the hospitals get overwhelmed or everything gets locked down for longer, it comes back to them. Now, the risk associated with all these other daily activities, that they undertake goes up because, hey, if all of a sudden you have your appendix is now bursting, which can happen to a lot of people, right? And you can't go into like a hospital because of that, right? Then it always, and that's why I like to really kind of always emphasize that it may seem at first glimpse that there's no risk to you, but there's always risk to you in one way or the other. Any way that you slice it, you just may not see it. Same with like the lockdowns, right? Like the fact that many people early on did not want to mask or lock down, what did it do? It ended up extending the lockdown, the lockdowns, because it really got out of control, right? We were getting infections everywhere. So now everybody's kind of like on the same boat right now, and so, yeah, if you're locked down now, what does that mean? Maybe it means that your mental health goes down. Maybe it means that your physical health goes down, and maybe your chronic pain comes back because you cannot go to the gym anymore. So all of a sudden, the risk of your own, of your own situation, like your health risk and the outcomes of that, now all of that goes up because a decision that you made, which at first you thought was of no risk to you.
So just the other day, I had this objection lobbed at me by somebody who has consistently always been on what I consider the wrong side of the science. But it was like, oh yeah, you and your masks, trying to use a chain link fence to keep mosquitoes out. Good luck. Don't you know that the virus is only this big and that the pores in a mask are gigantic and they're just going to fly straight on through? And I've debunked this a number of times in my various social media transmissions, but I'd like your take on it. Why would you wear a mask to protect others, and why would you wear a mask to protect yourself?
Yeah. So, so masks and going back to what I was just discussing are one of the many layers for mitigation, right? For risk reduction. They are not 100%. Nothing is 100% when we talk about risk, but they're one of the many layers for risk reduction. And, we know that masks work as source control. And I was telling you how, when I used to be working I still do, happen recently, but work in a clean room, we wear our masks to protect.
What's a clean room?
Oh, a clean room it is a clean room. It's a place where there are less than 100 particles per cubic meter. If you work in a level 100, if you work in a level 10, it's 10 particles. So very clean, a lot of HEPA filters, right? And that's where all the electronic devices get made, right? So electronic devices are very small, and you can, if you have
if one piece of dust lands on your circuit board, that circuit board is screwed.
That's it. You're done. For some applications, right? It depends. Some are more sensitive than others, but yeah. So if you're talking about a nanometer scale device and you have a micron particle landing on there, well, you could say goodbye to that, right? And so in a clean room, I mean, for the last, 60, 70 years of electronics development, people wear masks all the time because it's a source control. We are protecting the electronics from particles landing there. And then, of course, there are different sizes of viral droplets, and I've addressed this before. So the virus is always within a viral droplet, right? And within a respiratory droplet. And those range in size. So you have really small ones that are going to readily evaporate, and those can infect somebody. But then you've got these bigger ones, which are, the ones that the masks contain the best, right? And then, of course, you've got a whole bunch of other factors like humidity and ventilation and the gaps around your mask, because, we now know that, that if you are speaking really loudly and your mask is not well fit, you're going to see those particles being emitted from like the sides of the mask and potentially evaporated and being left in a room for a few seconds. So it really works as a source control, but then again, just because I have a mask doesn't mean that I'm going to like hang out with a friend a couple of feet for like an hour, because here's your other component with risk. And I also have that as part of my risk assessment tool, time of interaction, right? So, the probability of an infection is a function of that viral dose and time of exposure, right? Your viral dose is a function of the velocity of the particle. So, of course, if you're sneezing or coughing versus just talking or breathing, it's a difference in velocity. The density of the particle. So we know that a cough, as well as a sneeze, has higher density of particles than just breathing or talking. And the time of exposure. So, so a mask is only going to do so much, but it is one of the many layers that we use to reduce the risk of infecting another person.
Yeah, it's dose per minute times the number of minutes. I mean, there's when we're working with radiation in a hazmat context, you could have a giant source of radiation. I don't know, it's giving out 10 sieverts an hour, meaning that if you sit on it for an hour, you're dead. There's nothing anybody can do. It's Chernobyl levels. But if you run in there and like run past it, you're not getting any dose because you're not exposed to that radiation for any length of time.
Like the dose makes the poison, right? The dose makes the poison. Yeah, it's funny because it's interesting that you bring this whole thing about masking and the time of exposure, because recently I saw nutrition, let's call him influencer, he's got a pretty huge following, host like a tutorial or a forum for several hours, and everybody in the picture was unmasked. And he kept saying, well, I'm 6 feet apart. And I'm here thinking, well, wait, you do science-based nutrition. How do you not know that time is one of the most critical, factors here? It's not just you being 6 feet apart. If you're 6 feet apart and you're like a couple of hours in a room, right? Talking of all things, right? And the people that were sitting next to each other, they weren't, I'm not sure if there was ventilation. Hopefully there was. I mean, there are strategies to reduce like risk. But at the same time, what I constantly hear is people saying, well, I wore a mask and I still got sick. And it's, it's like, yeah, because it's also, it's bound by probability, right? It's not a fail proof. Just like you've seen studies of people that say, hey, this person was wearing an N95 and everybody else got sick except them, right? So you hear those stories as well.
That's to just go to real world analogies. It's like saying I wasn't even drunk and I still got in a car accident, right?
Exactly.
Well, yes, that's people who are drunk get in more car accidents, and people who, I don't know, if you're driving while drunk with your headlights out on a wet road with no seatbelt, with your airbags disabled at the edge of a cliff, yeah, the odds of dying all go up each step. But if you follow all those steps, the odds of getting a terrible car accident are still there. But we accept those risks. It's funny. There's this all or nothing mentality for some people. They're like, screw it. I've gone back to jiu-jitsu. Therefore, I'm going to take all the risks. And in your risk calculation model that we were talking about earlier, it's like, well, if you increase the risk in one area, you decrease the risk in others to kind of try and compensate for that.
It tries to compensate. It's kind of similar to people who think that, I can just eat well and exercise. And yeah, like that reduces your risk of some chronic disease, but it doesn't eliminate it. You still have plenty of healthy people who get sick and vice versa. And then everybody knows the story of somebody who like smoked like a pack a day and ate red meat and lived till like there were like 95, right? You still see those numbers in the data. That's why there's always what we call like the normal distribution, right? It's not like this all or nothing. You've got a little bit of probability, right, at each of those instances. And then most of the people are within, a certain area of the curve. But yeah, it's the all or nothing mentality. I think that comes from, I will say, a very fractured way of thinking about problems. And a lot of it has to do with our own biases and the fact that our brains are fantastic in the sense that they are efficient. If you think about it, you don't have to, when you're getting out of your couch, you don't have to think about walking, right? Yeah. You just like, your brain automatically does it. And I think it's something similar with our perceptions and biases. And sometimes it just is easier to say, oh, okay, this is what I believe to be true, other than going through the process of dismantling those beliefs. And it is an exercise. Even early on in the pandemic, it's kind of interesting. There were some scientific communicators who were not saying, how important masks were. So they were like, oh, yeah,
sure,
no,
that's a frequently cast aspersion against Dr. Tony Fauci.
Fauci.
That's probably the single biggest claim thrown his way to.
I hear that all the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would not have wanted to be Dr. Fauci in the last administration. And I think that was a very difficult line to walk. But I do think that his minimizing mask wearing or denying that it was useful maybe it was a terrible decision and that saved a bunch of healthcare workers, but that did a lot of damage to the cause in the long run.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you why I think that guidance was given. So if you take a look at other coronaviruses, you've got SARS-CoV-1 and MERS. In the Middle East. So the epidemiological factors were vastly different. So these were viruses that were only spread when people were symptomatic.
Oh, okay. So
I think a lot of that, this is like, I call this like the killer virus. It's got like everything. It's like the whole package deal in one, right? So if you think about it, it's lethal, but not quite that lethal, but then it spreads a lot. But it's not like the measles where you get 20 people infected on average per person. But one of the distinctive features about it is this asymptomatic transmission. And I think that came later on in the picture, if I remember, because they didn't really know at first what was happening. And again, and this goes back to, we are seeing science in real time. You're a scientist. I'm a scientist. We know what that process is like, but most people are not. So most people are not familiar with the fact that
I just want the answer.
Exactly.
We all do.
Exactly, we all do, but sometimes it takes like 20 different experiments. And then on top of that, there was a great Twitter feed on this. There was somebody who kind of described the scientific process to many people trying to build a 10,000 piece puzzle. So everybody's kind of doing their own little bit of the puzzle at the same time. And then eventually they're going to come together and they're going to find, wait, my data may not match with yours. Why is that? Let's look at that. Let's investigate that. And then, because science moves in the direction of the evidence. It's not the other way around, right? So we let the data do the talking and tell us what the story is. We don't build the data around a narrative. We don't construct scientific theories.
I'm sure it's happened on occasion. But you said earlier that like the difference between a scientist and a regular person is that, a scientist has been humbled by having his darling theory, by having to kill his darlings.
Yeah, exactly. Our egos are crushed in the scientific process. But yeah, and so I think early on, there was very little knowledge about, the asymptomatic transmission. And then because going back to mask, right, there's source control, right? So they really would be to protect people who are infected from infecting others. And so once that came clearer in the picture, it's like, oh, wait, we've got a whole bunch of people who don't know they're sick. Yeah. Then I think it became pretty clear. But I think, as I said, communication was really important. And I think that what was missing there was them just saying, hey, listen, we were wrong about this assessment. We now have this piece of information about asymptomatic transmission. So we require everybody to wear a mask. And that's an argument that I hear sometimes. People are like, oh, you scientists are just really snotty. You guys just don't, you're always condescending, or you talk down to people and you don't want to admit when you're wrong. And that gets into like the whole idea behind, the surge of the wellness community, right? Because so much of that has really, if you talk to people, if you gather anecdotal information from people who have turned to a wellness practitioner, one of the things that they're going to mention that is very likely, they're going to tell you, oh, I felt like my doctor just didn't care. He was totally condescending and he didn't care, right? So as I said, talking about these things is as important as the data, because otherwise then what's the point? What's the point of me having all this information if it's not going to be valuable enough to make an impact? After all, science is really, science has value within the context of what it can do for a community and a population, right? Otherwise, what are we doing, right? And so it's equally important to communicate science correctly.
Well, and I think ultimately that's why I'm having you on the podcast, because I think you do such a good job of it. How many times have you run into the argument that these mRNA vaccines are too new, we don't know what the long-term effects are, / gene therapy? Somewhere they mentioned the word gene therapy.
Oh yeah. Well, it's gene therapy because it's got genetic content. So the mRNA vaccines, actually, I recently exchanged information with somebody who was telling me about how her husband was one of the early people that received these vaccines for cancer. So this stuff has been in the works for a while. And
How long ago was that?
So the trials, I would have to look at my information because they had already started trials for a specific cancer. And I'm not the person to speak to the details of that. It's got to do with, matching the genetic content and then, injecting that, and then the tumors shrink. And it's been successful. So BioNTech had already been doing that. But the proposal of mRNA vaccines is 30 years old, right? So it's 30 years in the making. And they had already tested it. And what people forget is that to test these vaccines, you actually need a pandemic. Like you can't, because it's true, right? So if you have all these, so let me back up a little bit. So I always tell people, listen, when the burden of the disease exceeds any cost of an intervention, you are sure they're going to put a lot of resources into it, right? So one thing that these vaccines had for the faster track development was the funding. But the work had already been done. Like they had already figured out like the configuration. They had already figured out how to prevent, like vaccine-enhanced disease. So what they call ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement. They had already figured out the mode of delivery, the lipid nanoparticle. That was a long time in the making.
I wish we were using a different term than nanoparticle, because that just sounds so nefarious. It should be called a little tiny blob of fat.
Exactly. Exactly. So they had all this, and they had already started working on this for, I believe it was the MERS or the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak. But again, those viruses were very different. So people there got deathly sick. Like the fatality rate for those viruses was 10 and 30%. So it was extremely high. And when you've got those type of features in a virus, usually they burn themselves out because sadly, people die, right? People either die or they're so sick that they stay home. And then on top of that, they didn't have the asymptomatic transmission. So those outbreaks were pretty self-contained, pretty self-limiting because of those distinctive features of that virus. So you didn't have, as I said, so SARS-CoV-2 is fascinating because it's lethal, but not that lethal, and it spreads a lot too. So, and then you got the asymptomatic transmission. So to run these clinical trials specifically to assess safety, right? The safety aspect of it, you need huge batches of a population and you need there to be an ongoing pandemic, right? Otherwise, how do you test them if there's no spread, right? It's very hard to get those events. And so what I think a lot of people don't realize is that everything was ready. But this was a specific instance where like the timing met the opportunity, but everything was really ready for it. It just needed to be tested.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the best analogy, but it's not like the United States invented the atom bomb right at the end of World War II. That that started with Einstein 20 years before, and laying the groundwork and then doing all the mathematical thing, and then a giant financial push.
Well, I'll give you an even cooler example. What Elon Musk is doing now, a Neuralink. So, I've done a lot of the neuroscience, and so I'm really in tune with that technology. I'm very interested in what's happening there, and the applications for it. It's funny because nobody complains about that microchip, but aside from that, like if you look at the history of that, that's old. It's not something that he's doing something great, which is he's giving it the financing, building a company around it. But that research of learning how neuronal spikes, kind of combine to form a response, what you're really doing is you're looking at prior input to predict the future output of that neuron. And if you can do that, you can predict how a person is going to think or move, right? And that's how you get the cursors that you can control with your mind. It's very cool. Mm-hmm. But that technology is not new. That's also 30 or 40. You look at the literature, that's been going on for decades as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's there's all this research in the background. People don't realize it's happening. It's what we call the continuous product cycle, right? The continuous R&D. It just keeps going. Just like with these vaccines, they're not done. They're looking already at how to make them better, how to, combat the variants. I mean, just because they have something working now does not mean that they're not working on the next thing already. No,
I mean, there's a ton of really promising directions they could take this. I mean, wasn't it getting rid of malaria? Finally to have a vaccine against malaria, have personalized vaccines against cancer.
The implications are amazing, and it gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. I mean, I actually, believe it or not, I think that the research from long COVID is going to open many doors, because they're seeing, well, wait a minute, why do these people have an incomplete immune response? Why are they left with all these symptoms? And they have all these theories. And there is a huge correlation between viruses and autoimmune conditions. We know that it's one of those risk factors, in as far, nobody really understands the causality. What's the trigger? We just identify these risk factors, right? Like genetics and stress, environment, viruses.
Yeah, if you have Epstein-Barr, you may get mono. We know that
Exactly.
that's a risk factor, but we don't know what the hell Epstein-Barr does within your body to make you feel like your death warmed over for 6 months.
Yeah, or for a lot of people, it's you get a virus, you recover from it, and then all of a sudden you develop a weird autoimmune condition, right? And I think that what they're learning now, and there's a great I think a professor, I'm not sure if she's an immunologist or a virologist, and she's at Yale. She put down the theories for why people have long COVID. And she's saying, look, people who with long COVID are getting better after a vaccine. That's interesting.
Yeah.
This is how you design these experiments. And so she's saying, this is telling us that there might be an incomplete immune response, so that, giving the person the vaccine, all of a sudden it kind of pushes the immune response towards completion and people start getting better. And this has huge implications.
Yeah. Chronic fatigue.
That's what that's exactly what she references. She says the implications of this is huge, which is kind of funny because I could see the wellness community like,
no, it's our oil of oregano.
I know, right? Don't take that away from us. I know. I think it's fascinating. I think there's always a silver lining, right? Any way you slice it, the cost of this pandemic is undeniably the number of lives. And it's not just the lives that it's cost because of the virus, but also people's livelihoods. People have lost their business. I always try to be very empathetic because I have the privilege of being able to work from home. I did not have to, be a person who had to work at a cash register. And so I'm very, very sympathetic of that. I can understand how, or a business owner, here in California, we're a huge service sector. A lot of hotels and restaurants, they really have gone under. And these are jobs that are permanently lost. But at the flip side of the coin, I think that it's opened the door for bigger conversations, not just around, scientific literacy and that being a public health crisis. That is a public health crisis from what we're seeing now, but also around the knowledge about the immune system, because autoimmunity creates a lot of disability. A lot. I mean, I haven't actually run the numbers, but you can quantify it, and I'm pretty sure that it's in the billions, if not like trillions of dollars every year.
Well, I mean, you throw a million scientists against the problem, you're probably going to come up with some answers to the problem and probably come up with a few unexpected answers to other things as well. I mean, there's a lot of spin-offs from the space program that they weren't thinking about initially that were spin-off. So I'd like to finish with this. There's this idea, I'm getting this a lot from people who aren't particularly scientifically literate, and they're like, man, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. But there's experts on both sides. I've heard it called both sidesism, right? Like, so long as you can find somebody on
two sides. There's always two sides, right?
And I think sometimes that's true, but I think often that's just not. So how do you, when you hear two conflicting claims, I don't know, the death rate of COVID, the infection fatality rate of COVID is 0.0008% versus the infection fatality rate from COVID is, pick a number, 1.5%. Those are two conflicting claims. You have experts, and in air quotes, on both sides, some of whom have PhDs behind their name. How do you go about resolving which side is correct, or is the truth somewhere in the middle?
Well, for me, it's easy. I look at the data, right? But it's not everybody has that level of scientific literacy. Once you look at data and you stratify it, it really tells you it paints a more complex picture, right? Because we can definitely say, yeah, the death rate is, I think in the US, case fatality rate is 1.7%. People say, well, there's way more infections that are registered, but then you can also argue, well, there's also probably underreported deaths, as we saw in New York, right? So, but it is very challenging. One of the things that I'm seeing, and I saw it really early on, I saw somebody with Harvard credentials talking about vitamin D. And I actually wrote a question. I'm like, wait, how do you know? They're looking at data of very old people in Italy whose vitamin D levels are already low. So how do you know it's not, just correlation versus a causative factor, right? And this is a person from Harvard. You would think that they would invest a little bit more time and effort into putting out a statement like that. And it is very, very challenging. I don't think I have the right answer outside to look at the data. Or perhaps sometimes what you do is you actually look at all the pieces of evidence for each side of the arguments and see which one, which side has the more evidence, right? But then again, nowadays you could do a Google search to anything that fits your narrative. And again, that goes back to really being able to have the scientific literacy to interpret that information. I'm actually going to be hosting a forum on this in September. I'll send you an invite. It's through the MIT Enterprise Forum, and we're going to be discussing what needs to be done. Like, we all recognize this is a big issue. Not just, it's funny because I was just meeting with the people that, we team up and we design these panel discussions. And I said that I wanted to open up the discussion by quantifying the cost of misinformation from how much is it, how many people don't go see a doctor because they think they can take herbs for cancer, right? So what are the public health costs? What are the productivity losses? What is the loss in delayed educational attainment? All of these things, are things to really consider when you think about what is the cost of all this misinformation. It's not just people on the internet. This has huge implications, and we're seeing it in the US with the vaccine hesitancy, right? There's still, it's gotten better, but it's still quite high for a developed nation for so many people to feel, oh, well, I listen to somebody who has expertise, and they all have titles. So yeah, there are people with credentials who are really, advertising misinformation. I see it a lot.
Yeah. I think one easy heuristic is what is the scientific consensus versus what is the outlier position. And I think it was Sam Harris who talked about this, because as soon as you say that, it's like, well, what about this one breakthrough? What if there was the scientific consensus that doctors didn't need to wash hands before they gave birth? And then there was this one lone hero doctor who fought a battle, and finally everyone understood that, a lot of maternal mortality came from not washing hands. And so he went against the dominant narrative, the scientific consensus at the time, and he was right. And he was right. But I think it was, like I said, Sam Harris who pointed out that, yes, every scientific breakthrough has come from some kind of minority position. But at the same time, if at any given point in time you have to bet who's correct, 100 times out of 100, you should bet with the dominant narrative, because there's so many individual ideas that get brought up and get shot down. In a jiu-jitsu context, I can't count the number of really great ideas I've had that as soon as I try them out, they're a complete disaster on the mat. And I'm like, okay, now in retrospect, I'm embarrassed to have ever thought that would work. But the key to having good ideas is to have lots of ideas. And so to have, to go with the scientific consensus, yes, there's some retardation there, not intellectual, but just slowing things down, not taking one piece of data and drawing a whole entire narrative off of it. It has inertia, but at the same time, it's probably correct. Statistically, it's probably correct. Most of the times it's correct, and the minority position is wrong.
Correct. And then the other thing to consider is that times are vastly different. So now you have hundreds of scientists working on the same thing all the time. This is not the way it was in the 1920s, where you had just one group or two groups working on one specific topic. You could pull out any subject, you just Google it on the internet, and you will find a plethora of scientific articles.
Well, and COVID, my God. You look at the archive sites or not the archive sites, the preprint sites.
The
And there's
preprints, yeah.
10,000. I mean, now you got to take those with a gigantic grain of salt because they haven't been reviewed. But there's, I mean, the one that I go to most often, I think it's north of 10,000 articles on COVID in the last 12 months. It's insane.
Oh yeah, there is a lot, and and some of that is conflicting, but this kind of reminds me of the whole ivermectin. Remember the ivermectin drug is like the anti-parasitic drug that is off. It's also used for humans, but it's primarily used for dogs. And ivermectin came about because they demonstrated that it could kill the virus in a petri dish, like in a lab. Right. So, of course, the medical community, and I understand doctors because they were actually doing risk analysis here. They were saying, well, listen, if the risk is low, right, it was already an approved drug, right? So they're saying if the risk is low to my patient and there is any potential benefit of this,
yeah.
If I had been a doctor, I probably would have done the same. If the risk is very low and it could save a patient's life, even without the data, on an approved drug over the counter, might make sense, right? But what, of course, started to happen is, the narrative turned into like, oh, we don't need vaccines because we have ivermectin, right? And all these articles. Or hydroxychloroquine. And I've actually tackled both of them. And when you look at the studies, it's kind of funny. There was one on ivermectin where they said, 100% of the patients got better. Of course, that's your first red flag right there. Any study that tells you that 100% of the participants got better.
And we had 3 patients. All 3 of them got better. Okay.
But when you look at the data, at the paper, they had healthier patients taking the intervention than people not taking the intervention. And then they had a whole bunch of confounders. So they were also taking all these other drugs as well. And so these are little nuances that you don't really pick up on unless you've done the reading and you understand what we call these sampling biases and are the methods correct. For instance, something that I learned was when the first data on remdesivir came out, and it showed positive results, and it said, oh, it decreases hospital stays by a day. I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't have known that was significant because I think most people were like, it's only a day. But in the clinical spectrum, that is a significant result. And so that's why it's really important to talk to experts when one reads these papers, because you don't have a way of knowing from reading a paper unless you're very well versed and have read many publications. You have no way of knowing whether the endpoints are correct or whether the methodology was the correct one. How do you not know that the methods were outdated? Or whether the
data was completely faked the way it was for the autism and vaccine connection by that doctor 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Wakefield. Yeah. Doctor, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start swearing any point now. So I think we should probably bring this to a close. Thank you so much. I hope we covered some of the issues that people are interested in. You have to pimp your Instagram page. How do people find it?
Oh, yeah. It's remember that show Pinky and the Brain?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people
What do we do tonight?
So it's at Nini and the Brain.
Okay.
So yeah, it's based. That was one of my favorite shows growing up, and so I named it. My handle is after that. So Nini, Nini, Nini and the Brain.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I can't recommend it enough. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and
it's my pleasure.
Yeah, and good luck with your non-COVID stuff. And I look forward to seeing more scientific literacy stuff on your page. A year from now that has nothing to do with this frickin' virus.
I know. Yeah, honestly, I can't. I'm sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, more information came in. Okay, I got to do a post, and I like it. I like educating people, but I'm also looking forward to moving towards these topics that I think will be of more use to a lot of people as well. So I'm with you on that one. I'm just so over it some days.
All right. Take care and good night.
All right. Good night, Stephen.